Amen. Go ahead and be seated. I invite you to turn in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 8. We're going to be handling this entire chapter today. And as we've seen in this book so far, living in the ashes of Eden, living life under the sun, as the preacher calls it, can make things challenging, to say the least. We live in a broken, fallen world with broken, fallen people and broken, fallen systems. And as a result of that, we contend with sin all around us, and we contend with situations, organizations, people that try to awaken sin within us, but also we deal with external sin that presses on us. And so really the big idea today is that it requires a significant amount of wisdom to be able to navigate the challenges of living in the ashes of Eden. And we've seen already that this wisdom comes from God. We've seen a lot of the preacher talking about last week not being too righteous or not being too wicked. In other words, don't build up a false righteousness for yourself and don't give yourself over to wickedness, but rely upon the Lord. And as we rely upon Him, wisdom will increase and we'll be able to navigate these challenges that come from living in the ashes of Eden. And so there's this chapter really serves as a transitional point for the rest of the book, where the preacher is going to be dealing with giving us some wisdom to live by, having established that in sort of the big 30,000-foot flyover that we cannot attain wisdom on our own, that life's pleasures will never satisfy us, that we are in constant need of God to live rightly in a broken world. He's now going to transition into giving us some wisdom for living for the rest of the book. And one of the results of the fall, this is a statement that may require a little bit of thought, but one of the results of the fall is that there are earthly governments and authorities. And not only that, but those earthly governments and authorities don't always rule justly or rightly. So if you think about it, in the garden, there was no need for government. There is no need for authority outside of God and the authority that He had delegated in the family. And once the fall happens, what we see is that these other institutions become necessary and are actually ordained by God for the flourishing of humankind. Yet at the same time, there are limits on these institutions that keep them within certain boundaries or spheres of authority and influence. So if you want to think about this, in sort of broad categories, I think there are three main broad categories where there is authority in the ashes of Eden. The first one is obviously the government. When we were going through Romans, we saw that the government has the authority and responsibility to rule, to punish evildoers, to reward those that do good, things like that. So government is a necessary element of living in the ashes of Eden. It's ordained by God. It is for our good. And there are also limits for how the government should function and the authority that the government has. And so there's a second sphere of authority, and that is the church. So God has given authority to the church. And that authority is also limited, right? And then there's a third sphere of authority, and that is the family. And that sphere of authority is limited as well. So one of the ways to think about this is, though there are limits to authority and there are different spheres of authority, sometimes they overlap. So for example, let's say that somebody was abusive in some way. There is a responsibility of the civil magistrate to take that person and to execute an element of justice in the civil courts. At the same time, there might also be a responsibility upon the church to exercise spiritual authority in discipline for that person. But those two, while there might be points of overlap, as in the pastor having an obligation, or us as people having an obligation or a duty to report certain things and cooperate with law enforcement, what should not happen is for the church to execute a civil court where there's some form of civil justice that's meted out by the church. That's not our role. That's not our sphere. I'll give you another example. Parents have a responsibility to raise their children in the discipline and admonition of the Lord. I would argue that education and discipleship go hand in hand. And yet, what we're seeing around us in the culture is unjust elected officials and magistrates that are saying that parents do not have that right and that they alone can determine what is best for their children. That's an overstep of authority. Now, there's a lot of freedom in how the parents can do that. But at the end of the day, the parents reserve the responsibility and authority given by God for the training and education of their children. And so we can see that these spheres of authority have some overlap, but at the same time, they're distinct. And that's just a really helpful way to think about this, especially as we get into Ecclesiastes chapter 8. And really the question that arises out of this is, we all live under authority in different ways. And how do we live wisely as those under authority, in particular when we're under authority that is unjust? And that's what the text deals with today. Now, I also want to just preface this by saying that we as human beings, and I think particularly American Christians, really, really like black and white, yes, no, thou shalt nots. We get uncomfortable with ambiguity. We get uncomfortable without having a 10-step process or a 10-step program to follow. But one of the things that's come out in Ecclesiastes over and will continue to come out is that when we live life under the sun, you can't ever possibly predict every single situation and occurrence that's going to happen. And so I think in a big, broad scope picture, what the writer of Ecclesiastes is really calling us to is the fact that we need to exercise wisdom, and in particular, wisdom that comes from God in navigating the intricacies of living life under the sun. And I think that that's highlighted in our text today. So there's 4 points this morning, and the first one is found in verse 1. Of chapter 8, who is like the wise and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. In other words, we need wisdom, in particular when it comes to relating to government. Now, because that's the context that he's going to go into, that's why I'm making that connection. So he starts off by saying, essentially, true wisdom is rare. So think about Solomon. And Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived. You remember that story about the two women that came to him, both claiming that the child was theirs. And Solomon takes and orders a sword be brought and says, all right, I'm going to cut the child in half, and you each get half. And the true mother was like, no, she can have him. Right? What happens after that is that Solomon's fame spread because of the wisdom he used in discerning truth and rendering a wise verdict. In other words, it's incredibly rare for a person to have the kind of wisdom to be able to sift through a mess like that. And the fact that he was able to do that was noted by those around him and those in other kingdoms. And he gained a reputation for being wise. And life is difficult and complex and hard to navigate, right? We are faced constantly with questions all around us. Do I do this? Do I do that? How do I get to the bottom of this? What is truth in this? Think about when Jesus was standing before Pilate and he goes, what is truth? Right? We can find ourselves in similar situations all the time. How do we move past this roadblock? Do I need to confront this person? Do I not need to confront this person? What's the best way to confront this person? Should I let it slide? Should I not let it slide? How do I parent my kids in this situation or in this situation? The list goes on and on. Should I take this job? Should I take this job? Should I change careers? Should I continue on? Should I retire, not retire? We're constantly bombarded with all of these questions that require wisdom. There's a form of worldly wisdom, though, sort of like a street smarts, that we can often manipulate and turn and navigate through the world with some sort of political savvy without regard for what is truly wise, though. So while you might have like very political people or people that are really good at getting what they want by manipulative means or by being kind of shysters, there's a rarity in a person who actually has godly wisdom that can navigate through life using that godly wisdom. Who is like the wise and who knows the interpretation of the thing? True wisdom, as we have seen, comes from God, and as we will see this week, comes from fearing God. And so it's a rare thing to encounter people who are truly wise. not wise in their own eyes or according to their own worldly standards, but possess godly wisdom. And look at what it says on the second part of that. A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. So there's a couple of options here. The first one is that there's some sort of like physical change that happens as wisdom grows. Like there is a way in which our face looks different, right? And you can kind of like see those people that have that wisdom. You kind of see somebody and you're like, I bet they're a wise person, right? They kind of just wear it on their face. There's a disposition of blessing rather than cursing, joy rather than anger. There's kind of just this way in which their physical appearance literally changes. The second option is that your face kind of lights up when you receive advice or counsel from a very wise person, right? So I don't know if you've ever had this happen. You go up to somebody, you try to get some advice on something. They drop you like one of those wisdom bombs on you, and you're like, oh, yeah. Why didn't I think about that? That's perfect. That is the right way to deal with this situation, right? So I don't know which one of those the author has in mind, but I think both of them are plausible. And the point, though, is that there is a shining that happens in the face of the wise. And if you just take and track that a little bit, like you remember that benediction in Numbers, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you. And then you look at texts like Matthew chapter 13, verses 43, where Jesus talks about in the kingdom of God, the righteous will shine like the sun. We saw Moses, who had the shining of his face that needed to be covered because he had encountered the glory of God. There's Psalm 4, verses 6 to 7, who says, a man may say, show us some good. Lift up your face upon us, O Lord. And then he says, you have put more joy in my heart than when wine and grain abound. So there's a sense in which the shining of God's face, the shining of his favor and his blessing, cause a change in our disposition where we radiate something of the beauty of God in us. And so the kind of wisdom that's needed, in particular in dealing with authority, is a kind of wisdom that only comes from God. We need God's blessing of wisdom to navigate these kinds of situations we face, in particular when it comes to authority. Now, I'm going to expand this a little bit to include authority because we don't live under a king, right? So the application for us is slightly different than for the people that were reading this when it was first written. We have a different form of government. We have a different structure, which can cause difficulty on one hand and is a blessing on the other hand. Yet at the same time, there are these principles that sort of come through the instruction that the preacher is giving that will help us. So whether it's wisdom that God has blessed us with or wisdom that God blesses others with and that they share with us, the wisdom to navigate this world is a sign of God's blessing and is necessary for us. And wise actions don't just bless us, but they bless those around us. And I think that's one of the things that he has in mind. There's almost a sense in which in this next section, he's going to be talking about some sort of advisor to the king. He says, don't go hastily out of the presence of the king. And so there are these kings that would sit on these thrones and they would have these advisors that would gather around them. We'll come to this in a minute. But if something doesn't go your way, there's a temptation to just huff out, right? And so there's this sense in which this text is kind of dealing with people that are advising someone in authority. And those people, if they are wise and the king takes their wisdom, not only are they blessed, but the whole kingdom is blessed, right? Wise advisors will bless an entire kingdom. A wise king will bless a kingdom. Wise friends will bless their friends. Wise people in a community will bless their community. So we need wisdom. In particular, in this context, we need wisdom when it comes to relating to government. The second point is this. We need to seek to submit to legitimate authority. And we find that in verses 2 through 9. So there's a few things on this. The first one, look at verse 2 through 5. I say, keep the king's commands because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your case in an evil cause, or do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. So the first thing that we need to see is that there is a normative pattern of an attitude that seeks to submit to authority in Scripture. Now, this runs really against the grain for those of us who have a very individualistic, independent attitude, personality. That is a hard thing, right? But at the same time, we all live under authority. So children need to learn to joyfully submit to the legitimate authority of their parents. Now, here's the question. Are children to submit to the illegitimate authority of another parent acting like their parent? That's a question for another day. But what we see is that in some sense that if I go up to your kid and I say, hey, your bedtime's 3 o'clock in the afternoon tonight, kid, that's an illegitimate use of authority. I'm not in a position of authority to be able to do that. And therefore, that child is not under obligation to obey me because they have their own parents. The same is true here. He says, obey or keep the king's command. Which king? Well, your king. In other words, be subject to the authority that is over you. We're not subject to authority outside of the jurisdictions of that authority, and every authority has jurisdiction. Yet at the same time, what he highlights here is that there is a normative pattern that should seek to submit to that legitimate authority. So in the case of children, you should seek to submit to your legitimate authority of your parents. That's what God means when he says, honor your father and your mother. And another reason for this is that the king is supreme. Whatever he says goes. In this context that he's writing in, kings had ultimate earthly authority and power in their kingdom, which meant that things could go really bad for you if you just on a whim decided to disobey the king. So when I was in Mongolia, this translates in a way that's very different from here because we don't have kings. In fact, we cringe at the idea of a king being over us, right? There's something inside of us as Americans just bows up against that. But in Mongolia, they have a history of a king. So I was like, what happens if you contradict the Khan? And they're like, oh, they don't have a king right now, but they knew. They've inherited this culture where they know what happens when you contradict a king. Think about Joseph when he was in jail, and remember the two guys that were with him? There was the cupbearer and the baker. Why were they both there? They were there because they just upset the king. Like one day he just brought the cup and there was a little speck of dust on it or something. He's like, yep, that's it. Go to the dungeon. I'm done with you. And nobody's standing there going, hey, no, king, that's not right. It's just a speck of dust or whatever. I don't know if it was that. I'm just using that as a hypothetical scenario, but it wasn't full enough, whatever. And there's nobody that's saying, hey, no, you can't do that. That's unjust. Everybody's like, I'm not going to say anything. If I say something, I'm going to be next. Right? Which kind of throws into contrast what we saw in Esther. Where Esther, who is living in the same type of culture of an absolute monarch, defies the king and walks into his presence without being invited. So this is a warning to these ancient people. And thankfully for us, we don't have that form of government. But I think what the preacher's saying is you need to be wise when dealing with the king and that kind of authority. And he gives some practical ways in which to do that. The first is in verse 2. Keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. There's a couple different ways we could take this. I'm not sure which one is right, but the first one would be the idea of the people swearing fealty to this king in the coronation. Right? So throughout history, What happens is when a king is coronated, all of the nobles, all of the people, in some sense, swear fealty to him, swear to be loyal to him, and give themselves to his service. The second sense is perhaps this person who is an advisor has and is giving advice as a counselor is under some sort of obligation to the king to serve him well. The literal rendering would be keep the mouth of the king, that is, guard the mouth of the king. In other words, it could be a reminder to this counselor that he has taken an oath of service to the king and therefore has an obligation to help restrain this king from being foolish and making decisions. In either case, the point is clear. An oath binds us and therefore follow through with whatever the oath is, which is one of the reasons maybe why Jesus says, be careful taking oaths. Maybe it's better that you not take them than to take them and break them. So what do we do with this? We don't have that kind of government, like I said. So what should we take? So let me, like the simple one, anybody that's been in the military, whether we were aware of it or not, understood the weight of it or not, we swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. People in law enforcement take oaths. I think the first point of application is for those people that have taken oaths, you need to honor that oath. And when the oath is honored, people are blessed. And we don't take an oath to a specific king, but we take an oath to uphold certain laws. We take an oath to protect, to defend. And that's a serious thing. And so I think the first point of application for those that have taken those kind of oaths is we have a responsibility to uphold those oaths. The second thing, I think, is be very careful in making oaths. Because when we do, we're held to them by God. There's a sense in which when we take an oath, we are taking that oath before God. The third way I think that this applies to us is we have an obligation to legitimate authority to support that legitimate authority. When there's a legitimate authority in place, we have an obligation as people that are under that authority to obey that authority. Then look at verses 3-4. He says, don't be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? In other words, don't storm out and let your emotions get the better of you. If a king renders a verdict that you don't agree with, don't have a disrespectful, emotional attitude toward him. And don't rush to take up rebellion against the king. Right? Don't be like, I don't like the way that went. We got to find the people that are plotting to overthrow this king. I'm going to get into their camp now. When you run out of the room like that, I think that he's talking about an advisor here. Just the way that the text reads, most people wouldn't have that kind of access to a king. And so I think he's talking about advisor here. And I think the sense of what he's saying is if you rush out, if you act like an idiot, if you don't act wisely, you're squandering what influence you have. And you're setting yourself up for failure. Incidentally, as Christians, our loyalty is to King Jesus. And that loyalty, that oath, if you want to call it that, means that we have given our lives to him, and all of our lives are under his authority and rule. But it also means that we serve a king who doesn't need our counsel and advice. So on one level, we've got this earthly king, and whoever is writing this, Solomon or this preacher, is saying, don't get huffy with the king and don't take up rebellion against him hastily. But I think for us, there's an application jump that goes to King Jesus. Like, don't get huffy with God, and don't be quick to think that his decisions are wrong. So while an earthly king's decisions might be unwise, God's aren't. Don't get angry and join yourself with a group of people that are plotting to overthrow the king. If you talk back to the king or get a haughty attitude toward him, and he gets the sense that you're somehow disloyal toward him, you're in trouble, right? This earthly king, he'll just kill you. Doesn't have to answer to anybody for it. Be wise when dealing with authority. You can't just simply correct this king. So how should we think about that in our context? I think emotional responses to those in authority lead to disaster. So think about that. You're in a job. Your boss tells you something that you don't like. You get all huffy. You get an attitude. And you start acting emotionally. I'm going to show him. I'm going to tell him what's up. How long do you think you will keep that job? It's not wise. Think about the Ents in The Lord of the Rings. Like, let's not be too hasty. It took them a long time to plot against Sauron, and decide to go after the tower. I'm not going to use the real word because you'll think I'm more of a nerd than I am, which would be true. But it took them a long time. And Treebeard keeps on saying, let's not be hasty. I've seen a lot of people that are hasty. And hasty people make hasty decisions that lead to their ruin, essentially. Paraphrase. We need to learn from that. I think there's an element here where it's better to control our emotions and act in a manner that's appropriate to the situation and the authority that we're dealing with. The proverb says, a soft word turns away wrath. And so many times our hasty and emotional responses get us into trouble. The heat of emotion never yields good fruit. Now look at verses 5 and 6. Whoever keeps the command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's troubles lie heavy on him. If you obey the king, it will generally go well for you. But look at the other side of that, which relates to the last verse. Wisdom informs the proper time and the just and right way to address things. Not everything needs to be addressed right away. Some people like me really struggle with that. I'm really black and white. I'm like, that was wrong. It needs to be addressed right now. Let's deal with this. And yet, in the simple, not simple, complex, rewarding, joyful, frustrating act of parenting, one of the things that I've discovered is not everything that happens that's wrong needs to be addressed right then and right there. Like, that's a recipe for misery. It's just, it would be horrible. There are times when things need to cool down. And then it's a time to press in. So in other words, there's a wisdom that lets us know the right time and the right way to approach things. Again, think of Esther. Think of the wisdom that was necessary as she was navigating that labyrinth of dealing with the king and Haman. Remember chapter 3, there's a time and a season for everything under heaven. There's a time to address it in the moment. And there's a time to sit back and wait and chill out and let it ride a little bit. There is a way in which we're to address things, and then there's a way in which we should not address things. And all of this requires wisdom. There's no silver bullet answer that I can give you that'll just fit in every situation. In other words, the wise man does not waste influence. So we need to be discerning on when and where and how we take a stand and make a case for something. The person who always has a problem with everything and makes everything an issue will not be heard when there really is a problem. The one who's always picking fights and never submits will not be taken seriously when there's real reason to stand your ground and pick a fight. There's a patience and self-control here. And this wise person knows both what are the things that they truly need to take a stand on and when and where and how to take a stand in them. So even when life is weighty, wisdom will guard from rash and foolish actions that are actually counterproductive to the cause for which we're arguing or fighting for. So what should we do with this? Let me ask you this. When dealing with authority, how do we choose our battles? Just think in your own life. In dealing with different authorities in your life, do you choose your battles, or is everything a battle? Do we make sure that we're taking a stand on something that's really worth taking a stand on? I was hasty and unjust with my oldest. And I tell you what, like, I don't know whether this was wisdom or just happened, but I was addressing her on something that was not her fault. I jumped to a conclusion. I was wrongly correcting her for something that she didn't do, and she sat there and took it. And then once I had gotten that out of my system, she said, "But Papa, I didn't do that." And Ainsley, I think it was Ainsley, was standing over there like, "No, she didn't." Like, they've been trying to get my attention for the last 5 minutes while I was correcting my daughter, and I'm not listening to them. And she just sat there, and then once things had cooled down, she addressed it. Like, I'm like, "All right, kid, I'm learning from you now." Because I know where she got that. And it wasn't me. That's her mama. Because I'm clearly the one that's jumping to conclusions. Do we squander our influence by making a thing about everything that we disagree with? And with that said, implied in this text, there is a time to take a stand. There is a time to stand against the king. There is a time to take a stand and defy tyranny and injustice. But we need to exercise wisdom and care in doing that. And so, while there are times for disobedience, while there are times for taking a stand, while there is a right and wise way to correct, all of that is something that we need God's guidance on. And we need to make sure that we're not falling into the folly of submitting to our own sinful, selfish, impulsive tendencies. And the fact that we are living in the ashes of Eden means that these things are complex and they require wisdom, and we need God's wisdom to navigate that, which leads us to the third point, which is we need to live in faith and fear God, not man. We find that in verses 10 through 13. So in verses 9 through 11, he says this: "All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This is also vanity, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily. The heart of the children of men is set to do evil." We see that there are times when authority is abused. And it seems as though the wicked achieve prosperity and come to an end that is at least officially honorable. So think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a justice on the Supreme Court who recently died. Listen to what she said. "At stake in cases challenging abortion restriction is a woman's control over her own destiny. Thus, legal challenges to undue restrictions on abortion procedures do not seek to vindicate some generalized notion of privacy. Rather, they center on a woman's autonomy to determine her life's course and thus to enjoy equal citizenship stature." So here's a woman who had authority and power and actively fought for the legal murder of a person who is made in God's image in the womb. And when she died recently, she laid in state. She was honored. How do we respond when we see things like this? One option that we see here in this text is that inclines us toward evil. We can think, well, shoot, justice isn't coming anytime soon. She got away with it. I might as well too. Or the alternative is it continues to encourage them, the people in authority, in their injustice, because I haven't seen any consequences for this yet. I mean, Ruth Ginsburg Bader died at the age of 87. So it seems as though wicked people continue on and have long lives, at least in some cases. So what's the alternative to our heart being inclined toward evil? Look at verses 12 and 13. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow because he does not fear God. So I think the right way to respond that the teacher is giving us is an affirmation of faith in God's judgment. It's faith in the face of what seems like contradictory evidence of an 87-year-old wicked person that fought for the murder of unborn children, dying and laying in state. It seems like she had a long life. She was honored. She was politically successful. She had power. She had money. People sung her praises. And yet, though perhaps she had a long life, it's not going to go well with her. See, in Hebrews 9:27, it says it is appointed a man once to die, and then comes the judgment. It might seem like justice is slow in coming because wicked people live a long time. But after they die, they stand before the judge. And after we die, we stand before the judge. And we give an account, and all the intentions of our heart are laid bare before all of creation. The idea here is that those who don't fear God live as if they are God and then die. And that's like a shadow that fades and disappears, and then justice for their unjust actions will be done. In contrast to that, it goes well with those who do fear God during seasons of oppression from the wicked. I've seen and heard from people in my time training pastors around the world that witness to the truth of this. One pastor in particular who ministers in China comes to mind. So he has unjust rulers all around him. He has an oppressive government all around him. The leaders in his district are corrupt and unjust. If he is caught going to church, he will be arrested. And yet, there is this joy and peace and confidence that he has that we can find lacking in places that don't experience that same kind of oppression. Not only that, but there is utter confidence in his flourishing after death that has been promised to him by faith. And there's confidence that God is still at work in the midst of the oppression that he's living through. So they meet with caution. They vet people before they are able to join the church because there have been sleeper agents of the government that have tried to infiltrate these churches and get these people arrested. But you know what he doesn't do? He doesn't cower away from doing the right thing because he's living in faith and fear of God over man. He knows that God is the judge. He knows that his responsibility is to be faithful with what God has called him to do here in this life. Those who fear God have no reason to fear the wicked, and that informs our lives. This man in China functions as Daniel did under an oppressive government. Yet in the midst of that, with the constant threat of being arrested, it goes well with him. And it will go well with him when he dies and stands before the judge of all creation. And so for us, I think this means that when we have situations where we are tempted to fear man above God, our fear of God needs to kill the fear of man. Do not fear him who can destroy the body, but fear him who can destroy the body and the soul. Right? So when the culture around us starts encroaching on us and saying that we're wrong for standing against abortion or for marriage or for God-ordained sexuality and gender and many other things, we stand anyway knowing that we're on the right side, whether or not it's legal to do so. Free of fear of what people might call us or what canceling we might experience, or the ridicule we might endure, because we know God is God and we fear him. We trust God and not man, which results in courage to stand in wisdom when necessary. And it also results in the ability to submit when it's right to submit, and when we're called to submit, because we have confidence that God is in control, so we can submit and resist when necessary. And we've got to be governed by wisdom in that. The last point is this, in verses 14 to 17. Live in the enjoyment of God's gifts. This is a recurring theme that comes up in Ecclesiastes over and over and over and over again. And in Hebrew literature, when something is repeated over and over again, we need to really take note. Look at verse 14. There is a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom happens according to the deeds of the righteous. And I said, this is also vanity. The wicked are treated as righteous, and the righteous are treated as wicked. We can relate to that. We can see that. And even if you can't see it locally, we can see it globally. So in light of that, and everything he said in the chapter so far, he recommends three things. The first one is found in verse 15. And I commend joy for man. I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go well with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. In other words, enjoy the good things and don't waste your life worrying about the wickedness and injustice of the world. It'll get dealt with. And you and I are powerless to change it anyway. Come to that in a minute. We need to come to terms, though, with our inability to explain and limit injustice. And as those who are not the rulers, the best way we can do this is advise and use wisdom in navigating that. But beyond that, it's beyond our ability to control. And therefore, our focus should be on enjoying the good things that God has given us. And even in the worst of situations, there are blessings. And what the teacher is saying is focus there. Enjoy God's blessing, even, I might say especially, when things are hard and it seems like the world is burning around you. The unending burden and vexation, one author said, over the injustices and suffering in the world is pointless. So I think what the preacher is saying here is do what you can where you are and enjoy the gifts that God has given you. I think that's a pretty good summary of that. The next piece of advice he gives is in verses 16 to 17. He says, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find out. In other words, life is designed to be unpredictable and to thwart our efforts to control and master it. The great discovery of the preacher about what God has done is that it cannot comprehend it. And those that claim to be wise and say that they can comprehend it really can't, which shows them to be fools. And that's a really good place to be. God is God, I'm not. We aren't meant to understand everything, and we aren't meant to master everything. And that leads us to a place of dependence upon God for wisdom, as well as a settled humility in knowing we don't know. All of the effort we might put into understanding why things are the way they are and what God is doing in the midst of that are vain outside of what God has revealed. So I think this serves our joy and enjoyment of God's gifts as well. We're free from trying to be, we're free to be content trusting God and enjoying his gifts, and we're free from the burden of trying to fix everything. Now just think about that for a minute and how that would apply in your family. Just apply it there. The third thing he gives as a piece of advice is found in chapter 9, verse 1. But all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and wise and their deeds are in the hands of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. In other words, God is showing us that things are in his hands and not ours. The apparent injustice in the world is actually a strange proof of God's sovereignty. No one by good deeds can coerce his blessing or control him, that love and hate are terms of favor and disfavor. So we have to come to a place where we acknowledge that the events of history are in God's hands, and there will come a day when all wrongs will be made right, the intentions of man's heart will be laid bare and dealt with, and all the sad things will come untrue. But until that, we don't live there yet. And I think this serves our enjoyment of God's gifts in two very strange ways. So we can enjoy God's gifts free of guilt, right? So like if I have food, I don't have to feel guilty about some poor Ethiopian orphan that doesn't have food, right? That I will remember you for 10 cents a day. You can, right? I can be free from guilt in enjoying the good gifts God has given because he's sovereignly given them. And he's in control of everything. And we should certainly use God's gifts to bless others, but the point is a settled confidence in God's sovereignty will prevent us from missing out on the joys that he has blessed us with because we think that we can control and fix everything. The second way that I think this serves our joy is we can enjoy God's gifts because he's sovereignly bestowed them upon us to enjoy. They're given to us. They are gifts of his sovereign grace. So think of it this way. One of the aspects of God being glorified is that he delights in the enjoyment of his children in the gifts that he gives them. God is glorified in our enjoyment of his good gifts because we recognize they are from him for us, and that glorifies God. And therefore, to glorify God is, in part, to delight in and enjoy his good gifts. So let me close with this. We are in need of wisdom, so ask God for wisdom. We should seek to submit to legitimate authority, so ask God to give you a heart that is willing to do that and can discern legitimate authority, but that has a disposition for submission to legitimate authority. We should fear God and not man and live in submission to him as Lord. And so ask for the grace and faith to obey what he has called us to, whatever may come. And we should enjoy God's gifts. So ask God for the grace to not only recognize and appreciate his gifts, but enjoy them as a means of glorifying him as a sovereign giver. Let's pray.